I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, the biggest tech companies set to report earnings this week, including Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. This as President Biden's team continues to shape up. How could a Biden administration shape the internet? We have some early clues, and we'll discuss. Plus, Google is throwing its massive resources behind the mass vaccination effort, opening up Google offices for shots and flagging vaccine sites on Google Maps. The search engine's chief health officer joins us on the new $150 million effort. And ransomware was the #1 cybersecurity threat in 2020. What'll it be in 2021, and which sectors and government agencies are most vulnerable? We will get an assessment from a former national cybersecurity official. All of those stories in a moment, but first, U.S. stocks gaining, led by tech shares, as we await results from some of the biggest tech companies this week. For more on the markets, I want to get straight to Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta. Kriti, walk us through the day.
Well, thanks, Emily. You saw the defensive trade really take place in the markets today. A lot of nervousness around simply the $1.9 trillion deal that Biden has promised. This idea that maybe that deal couldn't come as soon as it was promised. So once again, you take a look at some of the indexes. The S&P 500 underperforming the likes of the NASDAQ and the New York Bang Index. So once again, those big tech companies really outperforming. That notable outperformer on the blue wave trade, the Russell 2000, small caps, essentially the beneficiary of that stimulus bill, really underperforming today, really showing you how much nervousness there is in the market. Flip up the boards, and you'll see one of the other pieces of the narrative today was that virus risk, this idea that Joe Biden has actually talked about a delayed vaccine rollout, some hiccups in that process, as well as installing or reinstating, I should say, some of those travel bans across the world. So you're seeing the likes of Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca all in the green. Moderna really outperforming after saying its vaccine would protect against 2 known virus variants. Nevertheless, that need for those vaccines really giving the sector a boost. Flip up the boards one last time, and it brings us to the stock of the hour. One of the biggest stories today, driven by those retail traders. This idea that GameStop, in 3 days, nearly 100% gains to the upside by retail, then pulled back a little, and still able to maintain 96%. Emily, this really shows you the power of the retail trader and how the amount of short positions that were against the stock has really been squeezed out.
All right, Kriti, that volatile and remarkable GameStop rally, certainly one to watch. We'll be following that through the next few days. Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta, thank you so much for that roundup. Now, as I mentioned this week, we're going to continue to see big tech results. Tuesday, we hear from Microsoft, AMD, Texas Instruments. Wednesday comes Apple, Facebook, and Tesla. Earnings season at a sort of awkward time as the relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. kicks off. President Biden has promised to get tough on tech, but the question is how. With more, I want to bring in Bloomberg's Austin Carr, who wrote about the evolving relationship in the latest Fully Charged piece. Austin, walk us through the clues that we actually know so far. Biden didn't talk a lot about tech on the campaign trail, but it's certainly been in focus.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, because Biden didn't talk about it too much on the campaign trail, you are seeing a lot of people trying to read the tea leaves of Biden's digital agenda based on some of the appointments that they're making, just whether that might signal repeat the coziness between the Obama administration and Silicon Valley, which was largely seen as friendly with big tech, or whether he's going to be a lot more aggressive in reining them in and sort of mark a new chapter between the Beltway and big tech. Interestingly, so far we do have a number of roles that are being reported for people with ties to Google and Amazon, and there was Apple executive on the transition team, which would signal sort of a continued coziness. At the same time, Biden has also designated Jessica Rosenworcel, acting chair of FCC, who's a strong advocate for net neutrality and closing the digital divide. That might be one area where big tech and Washington could probably work together on. Another acting chair designee would be Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, who, there was a great article on Bloomberg Law just talking about how she's been an advocate for consumer privacy, strong data protections, which would likely raise some alarms for a company like Facebook. And then more recently, we've just had, reports of the White House considering an antitrust czar. There's an FTC commissioner reportedly in the front running for Lina Khan, who served as legal counsel on the antitrust committee's investigation, which, again, that would be another signal that he might get more aggressive on reining big tech in. But a lot of this is TBD, and that's why people are sort of reading these tea leaves because there's been a vacuum of information about tech policy from Biden during the campaign.
Right. You mentioned the big ones, Jessica Rosenworcel, acting FCC chair at the moment. She's been on this show a number of times. And as you said, a big supporter of net neutrality. Then there's Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, acting chair of the FTC. And of course, two organizations that are going to have quite an influence. And the big question now is, not just the power of Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, but also in the wake of the deplatforming of President Trump. He has been suspended indefinitely from Facebook, banned permanently from Twitter. And, there are concerns about the power of these companies, not just from Republicans, but on both sides of the aisle. And I wonder if that makes tech a unique issue here. We spoke to Roger McNamee of Elevation Partners, who said Biden has no choice. He can't avoid tech reform. The question is what it looks like. What are the sort of signals we got from Biden on the campaign trail? I know he took some actions on Facebook, made some critical remarks, but it wasn't necessarily a distinct steer.
Yeah, it was definitely not as concrete or aggressive as sort of the Elizabeth Warren wing of the party in terms of talking about breaking up big tech companies. Biden had talked sort of generally about the arrogance that Silicon Valley has. He really focused a lot of his criticism on what he called abuses of power by social media platforms, reserving a lot of ire for Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook when it comes to issues like disinformation. And the most specific thing he did talk about was him supporting a repeal of Section 230, which is, of course, the legal shield that protects internet companies from liabilities of content published on those platforms. And so, the question remains, though, will that be something that they actually pursue more seriously in the coming months, with COVID-19 being such a focus of the administration, or will that take a little bit longer to get to? And likewise, how much will he support the antitrust enforcement efforts, which, you're right, does seem to have some sort of bipartisan support. But again, we just have not heard from Biden in terms of how he will support those efforts, although the big tech earnings coming up might change that.
Right. And these companies have, honestly, the stocks have continued to climb even as the rest of the economy has suffered. So I wonder, how does earnings happening this week kick off the relationship, and could that impact the dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, these companies, just between Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, they collectively delivered about $67 billion in net profits over the past 2 quarters, even while so many parts of the economy are struggling. And that's going to put a ton of pressure on Biden to respond to these issues and maybe set the tone for how he's going to deal with Silicon Valley in the next couple of years. Amazon and Apple, for example, are, analysts expect them to deliver as much as, $100 billion quarter each, which are sort of massive compared to sort of the struggles other parts of the economy are seeing. And with Trump, you did see, him taking credit for those strides. And the question remains whether that will be the right tone for Biden to strike with Silicon Valley, or that's going to put pressure on him to sort of rein them in and be more aggressive and say, these companies are too dominant at a time that others are struggling. We need to get serious about reining them in.
All right, Bloomberg Tech's Austin Carr, urge you to check out his Fully Charged newsletter. Thanks so much, Austin, for weighing in. So much to watch and so much to come. All right, coming up, Google is investing $150 million to make sure, they say, we all have equal access to vaccines. We're going to talk to Google's Chief Health Officer, Dr. Karen DeSalvo, next. But first, California Governor Gavin Newsom spoke earlier about lifting the state's stay-at-home order. Take a listen. This is Bloomberg.
At the end of the day, we continue to battle this remarkable moment in this surge, the most difficult and challenging surge we have faced since the beginning of this pandemic. The good news is we're starting to see light at the end of the tunnel, not just the light that vaccines provide, but light as it relates to positivity rate that's now declining in the state of California.
Dr. Anthony Fauci earlier spoke today at an event in Davos. Our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, spoke to him. Let's take a listen to what Dr. Fauci had to say.
I think it'll be this spring. I think we'll be able to do that this spring. And but it's going to be a logistical challenge that exceeds anything we've ever tried in this country. But I think we can do that. I feel confident that by summer we're going to be well on our way to heading toward herd immunity.
Obviously, that was President Biden, not Dr. Fauci, but additionally very important information in terms of where the Biden administration sees the pandemic at this point and our ability to fight it. In an effort to further enhance accessible information, the world's largest search engine is now also throwing its massive resources behind the mass vaccination effort. Google has announced it is pledging $150 million to promote vaccine education and equitable access, and will open up some of its corporate offices for use as vaccination sites. Joining me now for more, Google Chief Health Officer and former Assistant Secretary for Health under the Obama administration, Dr. Karen DeSalvo. Dr. DeSalvo, thank you so much for joining us. So a lot happening here. You're offering your sites up as vaccination sites, as well as flagging them on Google Maps and on Google Search. Talk to us about why you think this is how Google can have the biggest impact.
Well, Emily, thanks for the time today. You know, Google has been leaning in to be supportive of public health authorities since the beginning of this pandemic. People come to us by the millions every day and want information about health, but particularly in this pandemic, they've wanted to know how to protect themselves and their families. So in a number of ways, for the last year, we've been raising up information from health authorities like the CDC. And this work for the vaccination effort is just another turn of the crank. It's another cycle of us putting forward good information for the community when they come looking for it on search or maps or YouTube. And it's a way that we want to help facilitate everybody getting vaccinated, because as the community goes, we all go. So the announcement that we made today, for example, is a way that we can provide resources to public health authorities, to local community-based organizations who are often the most trusted on the front line by those communities, to see that they can get the information that they need about whether they're eligible for a vaccine, to address hesitancy, to build confidence. And then when the time is right for their turn, they'll know where to go to get vaccinated. So what we'll put on Geo, Emily, is going to be the availability of vaccination sites in all across communities, not just those that Google's willing to make available, but of course, any local facility that's going to be able to vaccinate people in the US and eventually worldwide.
So let's talk about the $150 million you are putting behind to help what you hope will be faster distribution of the vaccine, more equitable distribution of the vaccine. How can you make sure that the money will in fact do that?
Well, Emily, one of the things that we know we have a responsibility in is around good information in general, but especially around vaccines and vaccinations. And one of the important ways to get people to understand from the demand side whether they're eligible, answer their questions about vaccine safety, understand how vaccines are made, what is the scientific and regulatory pathway that's normal. We want to help those agencies that is their job on the front line. I'm a former public health official in New Orleans, and I know that it's really important that our message gets out to community, and that community is going to look to trust the local pastor or the local community health worker or community health center. So some of the resources that we're providing will be to help amplify the messages and the information that those local communities want to share with those trusted community members that they have. So that's one part of it. We're also working on some important equity work. We've already been partnered with the Satcher Institute at Morehouse to bring forward information to help us understand as a world, especially as a country, how we're doing in terms of equity. Are we making sure that the vaccines are going to reach the right populations who are at higher risk? And so partnering with them is a way to bring data and information to give insights to public health to know how to target vaccination campaigns. I think the last piece that I would call out is just this opportunity to make sure that local frontline organizations who are the last mile, they're really the place that community members are going to turn to know that they can get vaccinated and to answer those questions. So while we'll put information on search and Geo and YouTube, I also know that, you know, as a doctor, sometimes those questions that get asked of me right in the exam room, I need to be prepared to point people in a direction when they're in that moment of decision making. And that's and sort of another bit of way that we want to be helpful to the world to see that everybody can get vaccinated when it's their turn.
Now, as a doctor, we hear President Biden saying he can deliver 100 million doses in his first 100 days. We're seeing these models that say the U.S. will be fully vaccinated by June or July. Does that all sound realistic to you? When do you think this country will be fully vaccinated?
Well, Emily, this is no doubt one of the most challenging things that our world will ever try to do. In the history of mankind, we're trying to reach everybody on the planet with a vaccine. And it's not just one vaccine. I think because of the remarkable feats of science, we have a number of candidates that are either already available in the field and some that are in the pipeline. So I raise that just to say that I want people to remember that there are a number of vaccine candidates that can be made available for vaccination, but it's the vaccination part that saves lives. It's getting people on the front line to have that shot in the arm. And that work requires logistics and making sure that the supply chain works well, that we have enough medical glass and the right kinds of syringes. And it also means that there has to be uptake. People have to be ready to receive. They have to have confidence in the scientific and regulatory process. Where they have hesitancy or questions, they have to have trusted places they can go for information. For some people, that's going to be CDC. For others, as I've said, it's going to be their local doctor or the local pastor or community health worker. So it's a complex operation we're trying to all undertake, and that's why Google wants to do our part. I mean, to me, this is going to be an opportunity for everybody to lean in the public and private sector to put forward what they can, whether it's facilities, information, or resources, so that we can get everybody vaccinated in a timely fashion.
Now, we don't have much time left, but this is a really important question. How do you feel as a doctor? How satisfied are you with the efforts that Google has made so far to combat misinformation and vaccine misinformation, not just on Google itself, but also YouTube?
I joined Google a year ago, and my background in medicine and public health was an amazing opportunity to marry up with the technologist here. What I didn't realize was the millions of people that come to us for information every day, and we take that as a serious responsibility. Not only do we want to raise information from the CDC or the World Health Organization or local state health agencies, but we want to be on the lookout for misinformation. And so a really important bit of the work that we do is seeing that we're getting in front of misinformation, and where we can, especially in services like YouTube, that we're helping to remove it where it's harmful, or creating content with influencers that they can bring that science right to the communities that really trust them already. So we consider it a major responsibility, and I think we've been doing great work across the world to address not only misinformation, but bringing forward quality information. We're going to keep leaning in to do that for this pandemic and beyond.
YouTube recently hired a doctor to strike some partnerships and try to get more of that quality information online, partnerships with with Mayo Clinic, with the Cleveland Clinic. Do you think the secret to this could be Google bringing in more health experts like yourself?
Well, we have been building up our in-house clinical expertise. We also know that it's a big world and it's a diverse world, and to have truly inclusive health information, that we're going to have to rely on partners, not just what we can build in-house. So we're really grateful to those who have been willing to partner with us through YouTube. We're going to do the same as we have in the past on search. I mean, we have, even before the pandemic, been working with groups like the National Health Service or the CDC or some of the mental health agencies in the US, so that when people ask questions about diabetes or depression, that they have a pathway they can navigate that brings them to authoritative resources. Google doesn't need to create a lot of this information. It's just that we need to help amplify the good information that's being created by these public health and other groups. So you're seeing us on the beginning of a journey, very accelerated by a pandemic, of wanting to be to meet people where they are, to be a great partner to public health and to medicine. And we look forward to continuing that after we can end this pandemic.
Dr. Karen DeSalvo, Google Chief Health Officer, we hope it works. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about what Google is doing to help. We'll have more of Bloomberg Technology after this quick break. This is Bloomberg.
There are a few things that are really complicated and overlapping that explain almost the unimaginable, that a very, very rich country, which before the outbreak was judged by a number of evaluating organizations to be the best prepared for a pandemic actually got hit the worst. And I think what it reflects is, I hope, things that we could learn, lessons for the future. First of all, something that the Prime Minister mentioned, we had the opposite. We had a situation where instead of concentrating from the top on the science and realizing that we must make decisions based on data and based on evidence, there was a considerable amount of mixed messaging about what needed to be done from the top down. And that really cost us dearly. The other thing that may involve things that are going on in other countries, but certainly intensively going on in the United States, it makes it extremely problematic to adequately address a public health crisis when you're in the middle of a profound degree of divisiveness in the country. When public health issues become politically charged, like wearing a mask or not becomes a political statement, you cannot imagine how destructive that is to any unified public health message.
Do you think that in the end, the biggest weakness of America is a healthcare system that is designed to look after the old and especially the rich, that any pandemic was bound to expose something, given the fact that America does not have a public health system on the same level as the other countries represented here?
You know, John, a pandemic, as you alluding to, I think, and hinting, sheds a very bright light on a lot of the weaknesses in a society. For us, it did one of the things that you are alluding to, the deficiencies of our healthcare system, which really needs to be strengthened at multiple different levels for the reasons that you're hinting at. The other thing that it shed a bright, embarrassing light on is the extraordinary disparities we have in health, where in our country, similar to other disease, a vastly disproportionate amount of suffering among our brown and black people, our minority population, in which the incidence of their getting infected is much higher. Their degree of hospitalizations, intensive care, and death is significantly higher than the general population, related to the social determinants of health that have been ingrained in our society essentially from the very beginning.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. The silence from President Trump since he left office has been deafening, almost eerie. He's been suspended from Facebook indefinitely, from Twitter permanently after armed rioters overtook the Capitol, this raising questions on both sides. Imagine if the companies had blocked him sooner. On the other hand, should these companies have this much power at all? With me now is Natasha Lamb, Arjuna Capital managing partner who focuses on impact investing and sustainability. It's an interesting hypothetical, Natasha, and the silence almost underscores the power that Twitter and Facebook have. Certainly, President Trump has other avenues for getting out there, but if he was still on those platforms, I highly doubt it would feel this quiet, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a welcome calm for a lot of Americans who were frankly horrified a couple of weeks ago with the insurrection at the Capitol. And that was the most vivid illustration of what investors have been warning about: the dangers of hate speech, the promotion of violence on social media platforms. And, and that didn't happen overnight. We saw Trump sow disinformation about the election for a long time, and we saw hate groups start organizing over social media long before January 6th. So, Trump really became catalytic, right? If he was the match, then social media was the fuse he hit. And really, that's the problem that we see: how quickly hate and disinformation can be amplified through the social media engine. And as a citizen, I'm concerned, and I'm also concerned as an investor.
So, do you think these companies should have this power?
I think it's a complicated question. I think what we have right now is absolutely not working. we've been asking the social media companies to address content governance since 2016, when it was the Russians sowing disinformation, not the American president. And here we are now, 5 years later, in the wake of a deadly insurrection. So I wish these companies had responded to shareholder concerns earlier, but we are continuing to push for change. And, when we start to think about what's going to happen with a new administration and regulation, I think the power of these companies is being questioned, no doubt. And we've been ringing the alarm bells on leadership and how much power is in the hands of these companies. In particularly, when you look at Facebook, how much power Mark Zuckerberg has. We've seen. We've seen these companies, now kind of show some action, right? Show up and take down Trump's account. But frankly, it was too little too late. And the storming of the Capitol happened on their watch.
So on that note, here's the other question. Do you think they should have taken him off the platform sooner? Would the last year have been very different? And this is totally hypothetical, could we have avoided that insurrection at the Capitol? May it not have happened at all?
I think there's been, there's been so many warning bells throughout the year. Even when you saw last year during the Black Lives Matter protests, Trump tweet, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And that in and of itself was glorifying violence. And I think the social media companies have taken the position that it's important that a world leader be able to express themselves, and then they flag and say, this isn't right information, et cetera. But what was really staged over the last few months was a disinformation campaign that then spread throughout social media. And so, I think the company should have acted sooner because it's not just the companies that were threatened. It's fundamentals of our democracy. And I think they're in a tricky spot in, the fact that it's the president.
Now, if you're just joining us, we're also watching live shots of the U.S. Senate starting to vote on the confirmation of Janet Yellen for Treasury Secretary. We're expecting this to happen with no problem. But of course, continuing to watch as that live vote happens on the Senate floor. We'll bring you updates as we have them. Natasha, speaking of, we're seeing President Biden's cabinet shape up. We're seeing new appointments when it comes to the acting chair of the FCC, the acting chair of the FTC. We're waiting for those posts to be officially filled. But given all of these issues that you see, what action would you like to see the Biden administration take on tech, especially social media companies?
Well, I think there's two actions I'd like to see. One, I'd like to see the companies themselves take the action of improving leadership. We've asked them to add human and civil rights experts to their boards so that they're actually, it's the leadership that's addressing these issues. And then, in terms of looking at Section 230, which is the rule that protects internet companies against legal liabilities for what's posted on their platforms, that needs to be addressed so that there's some level of accountability. And frankly, it's been a strikingly bipartisan idea that social media companies need reform. Of course, Trump and Biden have both called for Section 230 to be revoked with different motivations, but there's common ground that there should be some kind of common sense regulation. And so, it's not a simple question, right? There's this dichotomy that's set that, are these companies common carriers and anything flies, or are they publishers with editorial judgment? And, if you look at social media companies, they're akin to a bookstore, right? They don't have to carry everything. They're not common carriers, but they also don't need to put everything in their front window and treat everything the same. But when, content that's promoting hate, when algorithms are giving that oxygen, in fact, that's editorial judgment. So it's going to take some real expertise and some grown-ups in the room to get this work done. And we just saw Biden, appoint a acting chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, who if named would actually be the first woman chair in the history of the SEC. But she said that she doesn't want any change to Section 230, that it wouldn't happen through the FCC. And so I think, in fact, it would happen through Congress. And we really need a bipartisan approach to this issue so that, our democracy isn't under attack again.
All right, and you're right, Jessica Rosenworcel, she's been on the show a couple of times in the last year and has emphasized she doesn't think Section 230 falls into the purview of the FCC, that it would have to be something taken on by Congress. Her other peers on the FCC might disagree, but certainly that is a signal, and we'll be watching to see who gets that official slot in the chair position. Natasha Lamb of Arjuna Capital, as always, thanks so much for joining us. We're continuing to watch the Senate floor, where they are voting on the potential confirmation of Janet Yellen as the nation's next Treasury Secretary. We will keep you updated on that as the vote continues. And coming up, is Silicon Valley losing its luster among venture capitalists? We're going to talk to someone who predicts the Bay Area's share of total VC deals in the U.S. is actually going to fall 20% for the first time ever. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Countless cities have spent years trying to sprout their own Silicon Valleys. Talk of a so-called tech exodus from California is hitting fever pitch as companies and workers relocate to places like Austin and Miami. In fact, PitchBook is reporting that venture capital is already starting to trickle out of the Bay Area. Joining us to discuss, PitchBook Director of Institutional Research, Nizar Tarhouni. Nizar, thank you so much for joining us. So you believe that deal count, the share that the Bay Area claims of deal count is actually going to decrease. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think if you take a step back and look at the broader industry as a whole, particularly in 2020, you saw $290 billion come back to institutional investors via venture-backed exits, and you saw $156 billion deployed into the ecosystem, which gives you positive net cash flow back into the industry of about $134 billion. And we expect a lot of that capital to come back into the market. But what we saw in previous years is we started to see funds being raised in different ecosystems outside of Silicon Valley, whether that's in Michigan or in Florida or in the Midwest in general. And I think what we saw so far in 2020 is a pull-through of also transaction flow starting to happen in those cities at a bigger clip. I think what it takes for those ecosystems to be successful is they need a lot of larger nominal outcomes from a dollars perspective in the exit market. And while we haven't seen that significantly yet, we're starting to see a lot more early stage investments make their way there. And so what we're seeing right now, COVID-19 kind of created this pull-through effect of creating a lot more viable targets there from an early stage and seed investment activity perspective. And we think that's going to continue to push forward over the next number of years, which then is going to equal bigger outcomes in those areas. And so we think we're at the early stages of this shift happening. We think COVID-19 has really propelled it forward. And there are some, I think total dollar value is still going to be a lot higher in Silicon Valley, but we think we'll see the flow of companies being founded and funded in outside regions is going to really pick up here in the next couple of years.
Meantime, obviously, the external environment is changing dramatically. There's, these SPACs, potentially hundreds of them, looking to acquire tech companies, and there's some concern that could increase valuations and impact the venture capital landscape. What influence do you expect that to have on deal flow and where the dollars go?
Yeah, so I think that if you think about SPACs, you're adding another added element of innovation into the venture-backed ecosystem in the late stage that allows for a lot of different alternative liquidity options to the traditional IPO, M&A exit, or private equity buyout exit avenue. And I think when you look at a lot of companies in the venture-backed ecosystem, we talk a lot about the late stage companies like the Airbnbs or like the Ubers or the Slacks that can make it through a public listing, but there's a number of companies that are incredibly successful, that are growing at a good clip, but aren't attractive enough or maybe aren't large enough to be able to take the risk from a pricing perspective or be able to really afford the process of going through with an IPO. And so I think we've seen private equity pick up quite a bit to jump into some of those transactions, and I think SPAC's another added innovation to allow some of these companies to really move forward in a public setting and raise more capital and increase their brand through that. Now, that being said, I think we've seen non-traditional investors play, and that includes asset managers, drive a really big portion of lead transactions and venture-backed transactions over the past number of years, and that continued in 2020. I think what we do by going through the SPAC market, it allows a lot of these investors to also be involved, which we think will continue. And so I don't think it's going to drive valuations per se for some of your, good, solid companies. I think there's some outsized companies like what we've seen in the mobility space where we might see that. But in general, I think it just provides another valve to allow these companies to find liquidity, find the public market, and add another added innovation to allow a lot of these venture-backed companies to exit.
Now, the Senate is actually voting on the confirmation of Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary right now. Speaking of President Biden filling out his cabinet, obviously he has unveiled his economic plan, but we are in the middle of a recession. A lot of folks have lost their jobs. Tech companies are among the few that have done well through the pandemic. How do you think a new administration will influence where folks put their money and make their bets right now?
I think the industry has actually done a number of great things over the past few years to really elevate its brand and the role that it can play for the U.S. government and for the country as a whole from an economic perspective. If you think about where venture investors are spending a lot of their time and where they're allocating a lot of their dollars, you're seeing that in technology, and obviously you're seeing that in healthcare. And those have always been traditional hubs and places and stores of capital in the venture industry. And so I think as we move through the pandemic, we saw healthcare, biotech, and pharmaceutical transactions receive ample investments from venture. I think we saw technology really accelerate and smooth out the volatility that you might have had in terms of working from home and bringing employee bases to be able to work remotely. And so I think as you move forward, you're going to see an administration that's a lot more friendly and willing to work with the venture community. And I think the venture community has done a number of things to make sure they can work closer there. I think as you think about things from climate change or pharmaceuticals in general, I think a lot of that's going to be driven by venture-backed companies. And so I think there's a lot of good synergy there between this industry in a way that really hasn't existed before with the U.S. government. And I think the administration is going to take well to that.
All right, Nizar Tarhouni, Director of Institutional Research for PitchBook, thanks so much for giving us your outlook there. Again, we are continuing to watch the Senate voting right now on the potential confirmation of Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary of the United States. The vote is ongoing. We will bring you any updates as we have them. Still ahead, President Biden is asking for more money than ever to defend the United States against cyber attacks in the wake of SolarWinds. We're going to speak to a cybersecurity expert next about what the administration needs to do to safeguard America in cyberspace for the next 4 years. This is Bloomberg. We are watching live pictures of the Senate floor where the Senate is voting on the potential confirmation of Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary of the United States. She would come into office with a full plate of issues. Of course, the U.S. economy is in crisis, in a recession. A lot of people, millions of them, have lost their jobs. So no small amount of work for her to do. We will bring you updates as they continue to roll in and the votes continuing to be counted. Meantime, President Biden has requested a $10 billion investment for information technology modernization that aims to protect against cyber attacks, a figure far higher than any previous request. This as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, rolls out a new public awareness campaign to fight a plague of ransomware attacks, which the agency says are increasingly threatening both public and private networks and costing billions of dollars a year. Joining us now to discuss, Amit Yoran, CEO of the cybersecurity firm Tenable. Amit, thank you so much for joining us. So what are the biggest threats this administration is walking into, and why would President Biden need more money than ever?
Emily, there's no shortage of fantastic threats out there. You have nation states, you have foreign intelligence services, you have cyber criminals, you have miscreants, and all sorts of troublemakers. So there are lots of threats out there and lots of exposure. Our country and society use technology in every way, shape, or form. And so there's lots of exposure that needs to be shored up.
So where do you think that money should go? I mean, where do you think he should invest it, and how to use the resources that he does have at his disposal?
Yeah, well, there's in the current proposal, there's a lot of money being requested for IT modernization. That should come as no surprise. You see a lot of older legacy systems, which over time become increasingly exposed. They aren't maintained. They aren't patched. When new vulnerabilities are discovered, those systems aren't managed in many cases in a very sort of professional way. And so they end up becoming exposed. Many times vendors stop producing patches after a certain number of years. So a lot of money appears to be going toward awareness. A lot of money appears to be going toward modernization. And those are some of the fundamental things which are required. But again, this issue is cross-cutting, and it's going to require a tremendous effort on the part of the federal government, but also in the private sector where so many of these systems reside.
All right, it looks like Janet Yellen now has the votes she needs from the Senate to be confirmed as Treasury Secretary of the United States. This would make her the 78th Treasury Secretary of the United States of America, the first woman, of course, to hold the job, and only the second American to have ever run both the Federal Reserve and been Treasury Secretary of this country. Also the first woman, as you know, to head the U.S. Central Bank. She left, of course, in 2018, but oversaw a winding back in general of monetary stimulus policy. As I mentioned earlier, she comes in with a full slate of issues, the economy in a recession, millions of Americans having lost their jobs, and we do expect Janet Yellen to become Treasury Secretary of the United States. She has the votes in the Senate. Amit Yoran, CEO of Tenable, still with us talking about cybersecurity. Obviously, we're seeing President Biden's cabinet being rounded out. We're still waiting for more appointments on the security front. But I wonder what your advice is to the Biden administration when it comes to tackling an unprecedented threat landscape.
Well, an incoming administration, I think, at its core needs to recognize that cybersecurity and technology risk are absolutely critical across the board. It's true of every federal department and agency, and it's also true of every major sector of the economy. So all organizations, all enterprises leverage technology in a way that makes them more efficient. That efficiency and use of technology also make them vulnerable to attack. And so we've seen lots of examples, and over the last year alone, nearly $1 trillion of loss because of cybersecurity breaches, ransomware, and other things. So this is a significant issue that the administration has the opportunity to address head on.
You put out a study recently, 77% of companies say they expect attacks to increase. Of course, we're on the back end of this SolarWinds hack, which, to be fair, is still unfolding. And I wonder what kind of alarm bells that raises to you about rising threats in the supply chain, which can be really difficult to prevent.
Yeah, well, 77% see those breaches increasing. It's also important to note that 94% of organizations have suffered a business impacting breach in the last 12 months. So if you look at that and say, okay, 94% have suffered a business impacting breach over the last year, and now 77% expect that to increase over the coming year, that's pretty significant. And what that tells us is that boards of directors really need to get engaged. Corporate leadership really need to get engaged. They need to realize that, hey, this is not just something that the technologists in their organizations deal with, but something that has a significant risk to the enterprise and needs to be addressed and managed and understood at the corporate level.
So what do you think is going to be the defining theme of 2021 in cyberspace after, obviously we're in a new administration, a different political landscape, but also, sort of dealing with the some global rifts that have divided the United States and global allies as a result of the last administration?
From a technology perspective and a cybersecurity risk perspective, I think the greatest theme and opportunity in front of us really circles around this concept of transparency. We have a lot of individual states which have breach notification requirements, but that's specifically around the compromise of or disclosure of personally identifiable information. It doesn't require, in many cases, other breaches, which may in fact be quite material in nature, to be disclosed. And so what that means is that we have organizations which are underreporting breaches. We don't have a true assessment or understanding of what the threat landscape looks like and what the true cost to us as a nation is.
Amit, we'll have to leave it there. CEO of Tenable, thank you so much for joining us. This is Bloomberg. I'm Emily.